Yeah, thank you to Tatiana for organizing this journée. And also just to acknowledge how happy I am to be here to pay tribute to the life and work of François Brunet, who in so many ways exemplifies what it means to be a transnational scholar. So I'm very happy to have this occasion. Ménage à trois. Between 1937 and the late 1940s, the artists Paul Cadmus, Margaret Honig French, and Jared French collaborated on a large body of stage photographs of themselves. Summering on Fire Island, Provincetown, and Nantucket, where they lived and painted together, they would end each day by going out and photographing with a lightweight, handheld Leica camera, owned by Margaret. There's the three of them. Cadmus later recalled that over the next decade, the three staged these photographs, quote, when the light was best. The photographs, they were just playthings. We would hand out these little photographs when we went to dinner parties, like playing cards. There's Paul Cadmus with his Leica camera. Receiving these photographs as gifts, small in scale, most commonly 6.5 by 4.5 inches. The images they made over the next decade or so were collected, sequenced, and pasted into albums, such as this one by members of the Extended Pajama Network. This just came to light this year, actually. I was tracking it, and it suddenly appeared in the gallery of Keith DeLellis. Receiving these photographs as gifts or objects of friendship, friends and associates of the group placed them in albums. As you see here, this is from Lincoln Kirstein's album, which he later freed from its construction paperback in order to donate it to the Met, a series of pajama photographs that he owned. At the time, they were never exhibited or sold. According to Cadmus, they were meant to be tokens of friendship, to show around after dinner or something. They were essentially family photographs. But they were family photographs of a particularly intimate nature, circulating only within a private network of associates, friends, and lovers. Today I will explore one subset of this largely unexamined body of work in which the threesome, Paul, Margaret, and Jared, together created scenarios that dramatized the feelings of envy, desire, jealousy, and sexual intrigue that simmered beneath their fragile domestic arrangements. Stark and stylized, they exude a sense of frozen narrative and taut emotions. Programmatically ambiguous, these images give pointed expression to the stresses and tensions emerging within this self-constituted family, a family that fell well outside of accepted definitions of that institution in the years around and following World War II. The broad production of pajama over these years forms one subset of a larger body of work created by an extended network of artists, writers, dancers, and composers living and working in New York City beginning in the late 1930s, and that's my larger project out of which this is a part. Lincoln Kirstein forms a key node of this network, generating a rich intellectual and aesthetic world concurrent with the emergence of abstract expressionism. My larger study explores Kirstein's multiple roles as curator, mentor, and prolific essayist and apologist for those in the circle he nurtured and supported. And he is, you might know, the subject of a large exhibition, wonderful exhibition, at the Museum of Modern Art that just opened this spring. That, by the way, is a stage photograph in which Kirstein himself participated over here, his portrait, and then his gallery of photographs of members of the circle and of his wife, Fidelma, in his home. Kirstein's aesthetic and philosophical passions fed what I call a counter-modern aesthetic of enigmatic figurative painting and staged photography. Both practices drew upon belief systems predating modern epistemologies that separated self and world. Kirstein was instrumental in the philosophical rationale and support for this new form of what he called symbolic realism. Kirstein also supported the artists around him and owned their paintings, as you see here, in works by Jared French in Kirstein's New York home, 3 paintings by French. In Paul Cadmus's painting of George Tooker, his lover at the time, called The Inventor, the artist is imbricated in a natural world of occult energies, a magus-like figure whose creative expression draws its force from nature. I just want to point out this little mandrake figure here, which is a kind of allusion to a kind of medieval mythology. Sorry. This countermodern aesthetic drew from a wide range of sources to construct a poised and statuesque stillness centered upon figural compositions. From Piero della Francesca to Herbert List, you see on the right, a German photographer working in these same years, the sources for this current of symbolic realism fed a strikingly strange aesthetic of immobility, drained of motion and suspended in time. I've just begun to look at the incredibly close relationships between this body of work on both sides of the Atlantic. As if desiring to still time and history, the narrative arcs suggested by the pajama images seem to have been interrupted in their forward movement. The effect is to place the viewer within a frozen moment excised from its temporal sequence. Such an aesthetic turned photography against itself, or at least a particular version of photography in the 40s, turned photography against itself to create a sense of time frozen like a film still, rather than captured in its fleeting motions. This quality of immobility transforms the shifting character of the romantic and sexual alignments among this ménage à trois into static tableau. The immobility of the actors within the frame is, however, only one half of the taut dynamic of these images, for this sense of immobility is staged against a landscape of windblown grasses, shifting dunes, and turbulent surf crashing upon the beach that animates the stilled spaces and calculated intervals between the figures. The contrast between the actors locked into their rigid spatial frames and the scene with its unstable ground and fugitive atmospheric conditions is a structural element of these photographs, and many of these photographs. The aesthetic I focus on here spanned painting, photography, but also ballet choreography. This is an interesting tie-in with the choreography of George Balanchine, who was working, of course, with Lincoln Kirstein at the time, choreography, ballet, and needlepoint. And while I don't claim for it any unique relationship to the gay and bisexual identities of my primary subjects, I am arguing that a distinct kind of statuesque form and suspended temporality served a stabilizing function within their own complicated emotional and sexual lives. And this is a fascinating photograph that seems to be staging some sort of World War II tableau. Again, another area that I'm exploring. Equal parts family album, inspired play, psychological enactment, and formal experimentation, this work is difficult to situate within mainstream photographic practices of the 40s. Cadmus recalled that, quote, "We weren't particularly influenced by anybody. We didn't take photography very seriously." To take that with a grain of salt, but there it is, that statement to consider. Their stagings generated and tested ideas for their paintings, but making these photographs served other important functions as well. This is a page from the West Scott Wheeler album that closely documents the kinds of tie-ins between the photographs and the paintings, and there are many examples of this. The staged nature of pajama photographs surfaces explicitly in a letter the photographer George Platt Lynes wrote to Margaret French on July 18, 1946, to thank her for a group of pajama photos done on Fire Island. Quote, "The photos, of course, are wonderful and frightening and make, or ought to make, plot. Why don't you all get a movie camera and really go to work? Make a so-called psychological thriller. Send me sometime an assortment of the best old Fire Island shots to replace those I scattered." And this practice of staging is evident here in these two photographs, where you have the figure of Jared French acting as a sort of director, setting up what becomes this photograph on the right. But whatever plot lines were implied by these staged images remain pointedly ambiguous. These photographs, precariously placed on the boundary between art and life, fiction and reality, gave formal and dramatic expression to the difficult interpersonal negotiations among members of the group and among the pajama ménage à trois itself. In other words, this goes beyond the immediate circle of these three artists. Indeed, in their strange intensity, their often stylized poses, and their ritualistic quality of stillness, a number of the pajama photographs gestured toward sympathetic magic, a persistent belief in the power that images exercise over their represented subject. Pajama used the representational, or indeed indexical, power of photography to enact events and situations in a manner whose eventual outcome remained open-ended. These photographs functioned as events in the world, as propositions. Within their stagings, actor and scene together create a charged atmosphere poised on the brink of an act, creating a sense of imminence. But both the purpose and the agent of this act, however, remain mysterious, resisting resolution, and thus re-entering the stream of time. And these terms, actor, scene, agent, act, and purpose, come out of Kenneth Burke, who was a literary theorist writing in the 1940s. The return of a counter-modern impulse or belief system in the context of the most modern medium, that of photography, may seem odd. Yet the belief in the agency of art and image-making to give form to the unformed energies of libidinal life was a key aspect of their practice. The collaborative nature of pajama cemented emotional ties that were constantly threatened from within. Committed to one another, they acted out in the symbolic arena of these photographs the complex imbrication of respect, friendship, love, desire, and financial need that brought them all together. Staging photographs at the end of the day on the beach became a form of serious whimsy through which to explore, or serious play, through which to explore the complex interpersonal dynamics of the three. Paul Camus's emotional and sexual connection with Jared French dated back to 1931 and remained deep-seated and intense following Jared's marriage to Margaret in 1937. Jared, as the love object of both Margaret and Paul, must have felt powerfully pulled between the two. Following his marriage to Margaret, he reputedly, quote, did not like Paul's involvement with other men and was jealous and possessive. Margaret and Paul, in turn, would embark on a loving, guarded, and occasionally overtly tense friendship grounded in their mutual longing and desire for the same man. Margaret must have witnessed daily the bond between Paul and Jared, which her marriage to Jared had so painfully, if momentarily, breached. She must also have felt both competition and resentment toward Paul, with whom she was compelled to share her husband's affections. And this is a source for actually a painting by Margaret that just came to view recently. She may even have felt desire for Paul himself, as hinted at by one image in particular. Indeed, the spectacle enacted here of Margaret's desire for Paul may have been staged by Jared to sharpen his own feelings for his former lover and now his paramour. Paul's envious longing for Jared must in turn have been intensified by witnessing his marriage to Margaret. In each instance, the mechanism of desire was what the literary critic René Girard has analyzed as the mimetic urge to possess that which was claimed by another. Desire and longing, deflected, held at bay, or denied, recurs as a central theme in the mysterious scenarios of pajama, generating an undercurrent of violence that is held tautly in check by the formal choreography of these images. The three pajama principles explored the shifting emotional terrain of their ménage through role-playing in ways that recall another period aesthetic, that of film noir and melodrama, and I'm just beginning to pursue that avenue. Scenarios of barely contained violence, as I said, lurk in many of these pajama photographs, sometimes quite explicit. Yet these violent impulses are channeled into stylized expression, bordering on hyperbole. Some of these images point to a humorous or camp performance, that those within the network would have recognized. And I'm comparing these to a series of film noir stills, just to give you a sense of what I think is their very conscious allusion or referencing to film noir at the time. Sand, driftwood, and other found objects are agents within these stagings, suggesting the occult sympathies between natural and human actors and expressing the fugitive emotional registers of their world. Yet locking the unsteady trajectories of desire into these elegant, if fraught compositions could only contain them momentarily. The formal language and organization of these images immobilize tense emotional energies, while their narrative elements suggestively play out these fraught dynamics and gesture toward repetition. The triadic structure of desire, analyzed by Girard, becomes a structural element also in the lives and works of the photographs themselves. Triangular shapes and compositions occur throughout the range of images they and their associates created. The triangulation here, triangulation here. I mean, it's the triangulation of figures, this kind of very self-conscious organization occurs a lot in these images. Here in a photograph owned by Lincoln Kirstein, Margaret, Paul, and Fidelma Cadmus Kirstein, this is Fidelma, are carefully composed into a tense, if shallow, triangle, with Margaret at its high point, Fidelma, looking sulky, forming one end, and her brother Paul the other end of its base. Margaret gazes steadfastly at Paul, who lowers his eyes. The triangle of figures is echoed by a triangular shape formed by the vertical and lateral elements of a fence. Margaret's head and torso are pinioned inside the sharp angle formed by the fence post, its plunging point seeming to trap her in a visual vise. The image carried multiple embedded references to the personal lives of the group, along with those I've already analyzed. Fidelma, Kirstein's wife and the sister of Paul Cadmus, found herself in a triangulated relationship with Kirstein's serial love interests, a situation made more fraught by his long-term flirtation with her brother Paul. Associated with the number 3, the triangle has deep roots in Pythagorean theory. With characteristic erudition, Kirstein referenced Pythagoras, writing that the number 3 contained both, as he put it, both plurality and multiplicity, a beginning, a middle, and an end, containing drama and development. The triangulated compositions of Pajama drew their stable tableau back into the stream of time, motivating a story, a plot line, to echo George Platt Lynes' quote. In the form of a ménage à trois, the number 3 introduced a dynamic element that was not present in the presumptively stable dyad of the nuclear family, queering the dyadic structure of that nuclear family. Kirstein's fascination with the Platonic tradition descending from Pythagoras took shape in the form of the repeating compositional triangles and triangulations of these photographs, part and parcel of the playful philosophical and, I would say, clandestine associations shared by Kirstein's friends and associates. I would like to end by exploring the lessons Pajama might hold for expanding our sense of the 1940s as a decade. Their very name was meta-authorial, Pajama, consisting of the 3, first syllable of the name of the 3 principles. Meta-authorial, clearly designating not only the collaborative nature of their work, but the entangled identities of the 3 artists whose lives formed the substance and structure of the photographs themselves. What then did it mean to have one's individual identity subsumed into this broader collective entity? Creative collaboration opened up new possibilities that took shape once the demands of the autonomous creator were relaxed. But new possibilities carried challenges as well. The movement from sole producer or sole creator to collaborator was even more fraught given the emotional and sexual intimacy shared by the 3 artists. Pajama photographs activated and were in turn activated by the psychic and affective energies of intimate collaboration. Their very process had the potential to expand the boundaries of the individual creative self. But the demands of daily negotiation also brought with them a new sense of interdependence that exposed the 3 artists to the shifting moods and desires of the others in the ménage, elements of daily life that were beyond their control. The images themselves trace these shifting grounds. Some speak to a nurturing subjectivity. Some speak to a nurturing subjectivity as bodies nestle into natural forms that bend them toward one another. Here, driftwood, tragic, and I'm borrowing that word from someone else, tragic and weather-worn, offers a fragile framework from which to sound the intervals between selves. Or in this case, Sands cradle them in womb-like cavities that seem to suspend time itself. That's Margaret and Jared in the distance, and Glenway Westcott in the foreground. But elsewhere, the perils of interdependence take shape in images in which vulnerability is coupled with sinister suggestions of control and aggression. Here, Jared, shot from below to emphasize his commanding Svengali-like presence, stands before three lay figures draped precariously over a rope. One is separated from the other two. The triadic unity is interrupted here as one figure is symbolically exiled from the intimate group. In several photographs, spatial intervals, rather than suggesting fields of intersubjective encounter between selves, become tense boundaries. Here, the patterns of light and shade, of presence and shadow, map not exchange, but divisions and blockages. The sandy coastlines and open horizons where the three staged their photographs suggest a space of unencumbered freedom, but such spaces were also intersected by human dramas that conditioned and limited the play of possibilities. Indeed, if we understand the beach as a liminal zone between ocean and land, it serves as a powerful symbolic site within which to explore these fleeting relations, oscillating between a nurturing interdependence and vulnerability and emotional reserve. The queer family of Paul, Jared, and Margaret offered room to test the possibilities of intersubjective exchange that fuel their creativity, but along with those expanded fields came a sense of exposure to the cost of living beyond the defended selves of post-war masculine norms. Margaret, in turn, having chosen to live in this new arrangement, had little choice but to submit to its emotional precarity. Grounded in desire, love, and longing, the happiness and welfare of the three pajama principals remain dependent on the whims and passions of their intimate partners. I realize this is always the case in relationships, but it's especially true in the case of this triad. Negotiating the daily challenges of their uncentered and unsettled identities gave an existential edge to the work these artists made. Their work, however, was marked by fundamental differences from the emerging abstraction of the New York school, differences in aesthetic form, style, and approach. Above all, they departed from the main currents of American art in the 1940s in their playful, if sometimes tragic, understanding that selves are socially contingent, entwined in a dense web of both nature and human relations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Angela. That was fascinating and a tremendous paper. You might think this is completely wild, too much so to be possibly true, but one of the things that both the appearance of those photographs and your description of them as somehow frozen at particular moments and the energies that you conjured from that made me think intermittently of Frederick Leighton and Leighton's paintings, and that's particularly true of Summer's End, which you showed about a third of the way through, which even seems to have a title that evokes that particular type of 19th century painting. You've just gone past it, haven't you? That's it, the one at the top. Seems directly, really, to be speaking to that. So I suppose the question is, one, does that seem to you in any way feasible? And secondly, if it does, then is it in some way linked with this idea of this type of art that your protagonists are producing, which is in some sense counter-modernist? Because I don't have to remind you, Greenberg, not very long after this, names Leighton specifically as everything that art should not be.
Yeah, that's interesting, right. I think there's a neoclassical quality about these images, small n. They were deeply versed in Renaissance painting. They cite Signorelli and Francesco. It's very obvious that, in not only aesthetically and compositionally, but again, philosophically, I'm exploring the, kind of what I call the occult Renaissance as a source for so much of their work. And again, I think the figure of Lincoln Christine sort of mentors them in that direction. But so I think that what you're identifying there is a kind of deeper taproot out of which these aesthetics arise. It's a moment in interwar photography, which I'm beginning to sound now in relation to Herbert List. Herbert List is also doing these very, very highly staged, kind of statuesque, referencing classical sculpture, referencing Greek life on many levels. So I don't think they'd be looking at Leighton directly, but I think that kind of very, as I say, very carefully composed, what I think of as kind of deriving some way from neoclassicism. It's a deeper taproot. I got very interested in this a couple of years ago when I first started thinking about where does this aesthetic come from? And it is a kind of sculpture. It's also a sculpturesque aesthetic. It's also referencing sculpture and the kind of rigid forms that sculpture takes.
I'm sure that's right. The only thing that is perhaps slightly useful to use Leighton to think about is that Leighton, of course, is a major moment of the refusal of narrative.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
That these, Leighton's pictures like this, that might be compared to Summer's Ending, are pictures that seem to presume or evoke in some way narrative, but don't actually offer sufficient clues for you to begin to untangle it. And in that way, it seems they seem to speak to some degree to the types of emotional and compositional arrangements that you're pointing out so wonderfully in the paper.
Yeah, that's great. There may be some elements of repression at work in those earlier phases. What I find so fascinating about these is that they were totally libidinally open and exploratory in their sexual lives, and yet there's this tension between the aesthetic containment of the compositions and the very real ways in which they're grappling with a kind of open exploratory sexuality.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for a great paper. It's so rich. I have lots of questions, but I'll try to just do two. George Platt Lyons came up in the talk, and I'm digging in my memory, and I just can't remember exactly when he is photographing, and he has his body of erotic imagery, right? And I think those were private as well. I don't quite remember.
Yeah, those were very private. Yeah.
Okay, and so what relationship you might see between his practice and these. And then the second question just has to do with the photo albums and looking through the albums. Is there, when we put together photo albums about trips or we tell stories, and are there stories in the ways in which these are laid out in the photo albums?
I'm dying to know that. This is one of the challenges. Is really all of the principals have died. I had lunch with the last living member of the circle, and the next day he actually passed away. So I had a chance to interview him. There is actually one living member who's now very frail and living in New Jersey. So I owe him a visit. But yeah, those kinds of stories. They're in a lot of them are in the archive. I've been,
So there are no albums, full albums that exist.
And how people, but also the practices of album keeping as a way, I think, of cementing the network. And also, I mentioned needlepoint. That's another way in which they're needlepointing one another's drawings and paintings. George Platt Lyons was a huge needlepointer.
And they're sewing on the drawings and paintings?
No, they're needlepointing from the drawings. Yeah, it's fascinating, yeah. I mean, so needlepoint is not, yeah, no, there's a lot more to be said about that. But this is the only album this Glenway Westcott, who was a major figure of the circle and a writer who's a fascinating figure in his own right. And his lifetime partner was Monroe Wheeler, who was head of publications at the Modern. And so this album just came to surface. I knew about it, and I was like, where is this album? And I was writing and trying to track it down, you know, so, but to no avail. And then suddenly it surfaced at the Keith Dell'Ellis Gallery, and he let me photograph the whole thing. So there are other albums out there. There's obviously the Lincoln Kirstein album, but it's been taken apart, so there's no way of reconstructing it. You can only see but they curated these albums. I think that's the point. Yeah. Like Westcott album has a lot of images of Westcott, but they also are curating them to form certain kinds of, and a lot of the meanings are clandestine. I mean, that's another tie-in with lines. Those photographs that he made that are now in the Kinsey Institute, right. They were not for circulation at all. He would have been arrested. Yeah. So they're very private, but it's just come to light through a colleague of mine who's working on this. We did a big show at the Whitney, actually. Nick Mouse has just discovered that Lyons embedded all kinds of personal references in his fashion photography. So there's a network of meaning that is available only to those people within the circle. So, yeah.
I wondered that in Cadmus's paintings, it seems to me that just from memory, there are two sorts of sexuality. There's a kind of rollicking sailors ashore version of chaotic and even the bodies are chaotic, and then there's very disciplined paintings with a lot of sexual tension and classical architecture, and I wondered if there's any relationship between these summers and the painting. Well,
that was Cadmus in the 30s, and that's the only phase of his work that's really been written about in any depth. It's really, I got to say, there's very little literature on any of this, and what literature there is on Cadmus. Well, Christine wrote a monograph on him, but. That doesn't count because he was a friend. But Richard Meyer and others have written about those rollicking sailor paintings in terms of censorship. But what he does after that is really interesting, and it's a very different aesthetic. It's much more.
Well, the one about
grave.
Rome, the one of people in
right, the 1950s making, that's satirical. So he has a whole body of really funny satirical paintings that are, again, not written about and very rarely exhibited. What is the relationship? I think there's a satirical line that runs through his work, and I'm trying to put the satirical in kind of dialectical relationship to these poised, immobile photographs, because you're exactly right, they represent kind of antithetical impulses, and you have to understand them as what is their relationship.
When do the highly structured ones with classical architecture, the paintings come?
Are you thinking of... I can't think of the 1950s.
There's one called Triangle of Love or something, where there's an old man looking at a young man who's looking at a young woman, and they're all in arches in Bologna or somewhere.
Oh yeah, that marvelous painting. Yeah, a night in Bologna at the National Museum, Smithsonian American Art Museum. Yeah, that's a very, very enigmatic. I think I have a whole series of thoughts about that. I think that's Kirstein and Cadmus, but not that matters. But yeah, they're stagings of I think various versions of masculinity as well.
But is it post-war?
That's post-war. Yeah, that's 1949, I think. Yeah, because it's after, because the man is in the foreground is dressed in a World War II uniform. It looks very much like Kirstein. So yeah, many versions of the work.
Thank you. Jared's friend's last partner was Italian, and recently you're probably familiar that.
Yes.
That's right, yeah. You're probably familiar that some photographs of the album have come up for sale. They were shown in a small gallery in Paris. Are you familiar with that? Hundreds of photographs.
Show that image I showed of the car wreck, that was the stage car wreck with Christine, that's from a book, a very big book on Jared French from that was produced in Italy, which nobody, again, I found it in the depths of the library.
The one I'm familiar with, the catalog I'm familiar with, is a recent catalog. It came out 4 years ago in Paris.
That I don't know. I'd love to get the reference. Yeah, let me talk to you.
It's a private gallery that was selling the photographs. I'm not quite sure what happened to them.
Yeah.
But I can give you the reference.
That would be, I'd love that.
Catalog. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.